Right. How many people were here at Pentecost for the breakfast church? Have you? There we got courgette seeds. How many of you planted those? Have you? I did. Unfortunately, they didn't get on very well. It did started off okay, and then I kind of replanted them into bigger pots. They've withered. So I'm not very good at growing things. It's kind of quite hit and miss. That was not certainly very successful. And I am wondering whether I was the right person to speak this morning. Today's sermon is all about, it's part of an intermittent series we're doing on creation, looking at the Bible, what it says to us about creation and related topics and what we can learn from it. Linking with some questions that people are asking in the world today. Following on, for instance, from last week where Elizabeth spoke to us. And today we're looking at the land Sabbath from Leviticus. It's not a very common one to preach from. Not many Christians spend much time reading Leviticus. If you haven't read it or not read it the whole way through, you may well be in the majority here this morning. But what is going on here? What is God trying to tell us? And what is relevant for us kind of 4,000 years on in a different part of the world here in Devon? So as the context, Leviticus, the third book of the Bible, written to the people when they were in the wilderness, about 30 or so years before they would go on into the promised land. And there's all sorts of rules and regulations for forming a new society. There's rather a lot of blood and animal sacrifice. And if you get beyond that, which some people struggle to get beyond, it's about our relationship with God, our relationship with others, how we are to act, and also when things go wrong, how can we make amends, and how can we make sure that we know that everything is okay in our relationship between each other and with God. And various disruptions built into life and time that God puts in. And this part of Leviticus, this chapter, is about how they are to behave in terms of the land. Other parts in this chapter is about the year of Jubilee every 7 years when debts are to be cancelled. Something to remember about, 24 years ago now, Jubilee 2000, when there's a campaign, for countries to drop the debt, and so that was, came to the fore with people's minds of using it. And then in the chapter, every 49 years, land was to revert for whoever used to own it. And this bit that we're looking at this morning, God is calling for the people to provide a Sabbath for the land every 7 years. It's to be left, no planting, no pruning of the vines, and to eat in the 7th year from what grows naturally, from the surplus of the previous year. And in that 7th year, everyone, including the foreigner and the hired hand, can gather, can eat for what has grown naturally during that year. The message is grounded literally into a specific time and place. Now, one immediate question is, did it ever actually happen? Did they put it into practice when they went into the promised land? And biblical scholars say it is quite ambiguous, but even if it didn't happen, they certainly know that from what's been written, that the people knew that was what they should do. And before going on, I do need to acknowledge that I am not a farmer, so some bits about land things I am relying on second-hand knowledge, what I've read and things, or when I've used to listen to the archers. And we are obviously in an agricultural area, and we have people in this congregation who work in farming and people who in our life group. So I have asked one or two of those for their input, and one or two other people elsewhere. So I thought I'd try and get something, what they think of this for their farming views. Does it make any sense at all, or is it completely kind of, what on earth is this all about? This is completely not what you do. And hopefully I've managed to pick a bit and kind of include it going along. I hope I've interpreted things correctly. But after going through this passage, thinking about it, I think there's three things that we can take in 2024 here in Devon that may be relevant for us today. Starting with the land is God's. God can ask them to do this because he points out the land belongs to him and is giving it to us. It's also a theme in various other parts in the Bible. For instance, Psalm 24 springs to mind. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And in this chapter, the land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. The land is being given to the people. The people to remember this, that first and foremost it's his land and that they had to, and it was they were holding it in trust. I mean, in some ways it could be said that God is treating the land as a person because the people are called to have a Sabbath every 7 days, and he is calling on for the land to have a Sabbath every 7 years. The land is of consequence. The land produces even when it's not, even when we're not active, although usually not as much as much. Perhaps highlighting in another way how it isn't necessarily ours. We are part of a larger ecosystem, and there's many factors out of our control, such as the weather. And think, what is our place in this? So how do we view the land today and land ownership? Do we view it as God's? Do we view land ownership and generally things in ownership lightly? And does that change the view of how we interact with things? I mean, it doesn't take much to think about conflicts around the world now and in the past. How many of those are to do with land ownership? And and disputes over who owns it? Is it mine? Is it yours? Or I want that particular bit of land. I want to grab that. And also does that affect how we view ownership as what can we take from the land? How do we care for it? Can we do what we want in that situation? And farmers often have a different view of land ownership in that they often know and very much to mind that they have temporary ownership, temporary custodians. They may have inherited it and be passing it on, and even if tenant farmers, they may be passing it on in other ways. And even if not, passing it on to family, knowing that there will be people coming after them just as much as there were people before them. And that what they do will affect what comes later. And it's long-term view because what happens may not have effect for several or even many years to come. Such as with trees and orchards, it can take a decade or more for somebody to get the fruits of that labour, which may be somebody else, but that is part of a farmer's outlook. So how the land view matters. And although this morning, many, if not most of us, will not be owning acres of land, there will be many other things that we do own. Maybe houses, flats, resources, money, and think about how do we view those? Do we view those as being ultimately as mine, and how do we view it as sort of and from God, what has been given to us, what we have? I think it's nicely summed up in a prayer that some churches use when the offering is taken and it's brought up to the front. It is a prayer that has as part of it the words, "For everything in heaven and on earth is yours. All things come from you, and of your own do we give you." Acknowledging that ultimately everything is God's, what we have, and when we give back, it is ultimately giving back what is already God's. And leading on from acknowledging that the land belongs to God, the second thing that came to mind was that comes through this is the care of our neighbour. It's included within much of the book of Leviticus and actually probably in much of most of the Bible. But here we have this particular bit is that every 7th year when you have the land Sabbath, anybody can gather from what has grown, what has been left into the land, what has grown naturally. Anybody can gather, including the foreigners, the hired hand. Anybody can do it. It's not yours if that's your land. It was hardwired into the people that they were to take notice of the vulnerable, and that the new society was not to be like Egypt, where they'd recently left, that they were not to act like Pharaoh, but they were to be aware of the poor, the oppressed, the widows, the orphans. And elsewhere in the chapter, well, it goes, there's numerous places that continues that whole idea of you are to be looking after these people, you're to be sharing with those. And think about how they're treated, which I think is heavily linked with acknowledging that the land, ultimately was God's. Because if we see it as God's, does that make it easier to share our resources? Perhaps feel less entitled? I mean, the temptation, what we usually do, is to strive, achieve, and to gather resources and to make sure that we're secure, which is natural and is logical in that, to make sure that we have enough. But the call in the Bible is to act also in the ways that may not directly benefit ourselves, but think of others and to be prepared to do the right things for them. And here in Leviticus, there are some practical ways for applying that to making sure that people can gather what they need. There's numerous others too that's mentioned throughout the Bible, and ways that we can think of how that can be done today. And I know that is a core part of what we do here at church, and numerous ways that generosity is shown to others and a generous spirit. And the third aspect that very much comes through of this passage is one of rest. God is calling for the land to have rest, just as the people are called to have rest. I am aware that Sabbath is a loaded idea. I know from various conversations over the years that there can be lots of baggage from our experience, different interpretations of how that has been seen in the past, how we may have experienced it, and sometimes seen more as do nots, rather than about making life less fun, rather than about rest. But I think it's quite interesting how over the past number of years, I've heard various people talk about it, and it seems that it's being rediscovered. People are kind of digging into it to see what is it saying, how can it be applied for today, what benefit is there. And particularly interesting is that I have seen a couple of articles by people who are not Christians, who are coming from a very secular viewpoint, but taking some of those ideas, those principles, and saying, actually, some of these may be helpful for us today. Those who are looking into it, looking at the principles of what God is calling us to do and why. What is it, for our benefit, for wider benefit, and trying to work out in the 21st century what we can do that will help. Finding ways to include rest and renewal, recalibrating life to disrupt the usual cycles of life. And it is a bit countercultural, because society says that we need to work, get as much as we can, strive. There's more and more to do. And we do like to have fun, we do like to have rest, but within that, we can still be on our phones, we're looking things up, there's still to-do lists and we've got things to do, and temptation that even within those, there's still things that we're wanting to do, and life is busy. We're multitasking. But Sabbath is saying we don't create, but we let the Creator recreate us in those times. Let me breathe. I'm aware that this is a whole topic, or even a series of topics to try and explore. It's something that is very challenging. I personally find it very challenging. Knowing the importance of Sabbath and being quite inspired when hearing people talk about it, what they're trying to do, and exploring that. But then thinking, how on earth do you do it? How on earth do you fit it in? And some of that, when I was struggling to think about that, was even before having children, let alone after that. But how does that relate then to the land? What is the link? Why is God talking about the Sabbath with the land? And there are some practical aspects of letting land rest, leaving it fallow, which can help. And that's one of the things when talking to one or two people who are involved in farming. They said, there are some principles within that, up to a point, letting the ground recover from having to produce, and that the land does reflect that principle of rest, then restoring things for going forward. Which happened over time. In history, you may have go back about medieval times, a three-field system of rotating, where one field would always be would be rested and would be fallow, because crops take nutrients and things from the soil. So more recently, you have the rotation crops such as rapeseed or using more fertilizers. But there is limits with soils, and somebody was back in Worcestershire was saying how in certain parts some of the big agricultural concerns will absolutely maximise what they can get out of the soil, grow absolutely as much as possible, and then when they either sell or rent it out to other farmers, they have to spend several years restoring it up before they will get the proper yields, because it's had everything sucked out. It needs, but it also allows. This also replies. Wildlife to recover allows that to do, and one or two of them also mentioned about what also jumped to mind was that the stewardship schemes that happen of trying to saying certain bits of land set aside as well, for allowing wildlife to recover and to keep the ecosystems in balance. Some of them also mentioned potentially going off tangent, saying, but what about the weeds? And if you left that and different things, so there are various caveats in that for practicalities, but there are also some principles in there. And on a spiritual level, there needs to be trust that on the Sabbath God will provide. The Israelites, just like us, needed to eat. They needed to survive. They needed to have crops. There is demand for food, and those people I was speaking to say, would there be practically enough food grown? Even if you don't know exactly about farming practices 4,000 years ago, that would be the big question, which was in Leviticus 25. It is addressed because God says, "What will we eat in the seventh year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? I will send such a blessing in the sixth year that the land will yield enough for 3 years." 3 because it's year 6, the Sabbath year, and then the year after, whilst you're waiting for the harvest to come through. But it does lead to a lot of trust required. Will that happen? It's interesting, at the time as Leviticus was being written, as God was speaking to the people, they were in the wilderness and actually living it out, reliant on the manna and quails to survive, gathering twice as much on the day before the Sabbath so they didn't go hungry. Something else that came to mind as I was going through this, and was popped up on my news feed, was reminded about the Glastonbury Festival, which does have fallow years. It used to be every 3 years. Now I think about every 5 years they will have a year when it doesn't run. Part of the reason is actually a farming reason, is that it's on a farm, and so it's to allow the land to recover, so it's not this big, massive, almost, virtually a town coming every year to allow it to recover, but also just wanting to build in a little break, have an off year. They don't just want to be non-stop producing. In a recent interview, Emily Evis, who currently runs it, was saying that the importance of that, because they don't want to just be running continually. She said it's not. They don't want to be seen as being just about the money, but having just a pause to allow people just to take a step back. Now it could be easy to say, well, that's easy to do when you can, probably the most successful festivals around, but it's still quite a challenge because they could, if they wish to, do it every year, sell 200,000 tickets, but they've chosen not to. Or Very smaller scale, the church fund day, which isn't quite as multi-million pound income, not at all. But that doesn't run every year. It's every other year. There is that pause. So the farming, business, church outreach or other things, there is a desire and can be a need to do more, which is often good. But the Sabbath is a challenge to bring in little breaks. How do we do it? Well, that is a big question. And, I, like many, are kind of still at the stage of trying to work out what does that mean? How do you put it in? What, in that particular circumstance, there is, and I think everybody, it'd be slightly different. It's thinking out what would that mean? So then, at a first glance, it is quite an odd passage for us to look at on Sunday morning. Those who I mentioned asked about what their thoughts were about it. First of all, either laughed or said, good luck. And in one, it may not seem directly relevant. But as we've been seeing, I think it does speak to us directly about what God is saying about land, how it's treated, as well more generally about our lives. The specifics will be different from 4,000 years ago, but some of the same questions still arise. It's a question of how do we view the land and our possessions and resources? Do we see them as ultimately being from God's? And does that affect how we see them, how we will use them? Which can be a hard thing to think about. And does that then, following on, make it easier for us to share our resources, to share what we have with others, and seeing that as just the right thing to do? And how do we view rest, both for ourselves and corporately, the need to let God recreate us, as well as achieving? Those working on the land, that may be partly how they work that out at our benefit, on our behalf. But even if we don't, how does that work with us? Perhaps we need to ponder about that and think, what would it look like in our lives too? Some of these basic principles, are these things that we can use with ourselves? Are they things that we're already doing? Do we need to look at that and think about what God might be saying to us today? These are quite big things. It's something that probably needs to be thought over. So as we think about that, as we responded, we pause a moment, and then we've got the next song. But then maybe over this coming week of thinking about that, about where that might be, and whether that is something that we need to take it up and maybe think about how that might apply to ourselves. Amen.